The gilded gates of Buckingham Palace have always been more than just a physical barrier. They are a symbol of a 1,000-year-old vow of silence. Never complain, never explain. But today, that vow didn't just bend. It shattered into a million jagged pieces. The air in London feels heavy, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a historic storm. Why? Because King Charles III, a man known for his stoic endurance and diplomatic patience, has finally done the unthinkable. He has broken his silence. And the target? His own son, Prince Harry. But this isn't just another royal rift or a temporary fallout. This is the final exclusion. The atmosphere inside the palace walls is being described by insiders as pure chaos. For months, the world watched as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex lobbed verbal grenades from across the Atlantic, while the monarchy stood like a silent fortress. We all thought the silence was their strength. We were wrong. The silence was a pressure cooker, and today it exploded. The king's words weren't delivered in a whispered leak or a cryptic social media post. They were delivered with the cold, surgical precision of a monarch who has finally realized that to save the crown, he might have to sacrifice his heart. Imagine the scene, the private chambers of the king. A man who has spent his entire life waiting for this throne, now finding it haunted by the ghosts of family betrayal. Sources say the decision came after a series of confidential briefings that left no room for doubt. The final exclusion isn't just a phrase. It's a legal and emotional severance that redefines the future of the British monarchy. This is the moment the palace mask didn't just slip. It was ripped off by the sovereign himself. The headlines are screaming, but they can't capture the raw, visceral emotion of what is happening behind the scenes. They say the king was in tears, not out of weakness, but out of the sheer agony of a father realizing his son has become an existential threat to the institution he swore to protect. The betrayal isn't new, but the response is revolutionary. For the first time in history, we are seeing the crown fight back, not with PR spin, but with a devastating reality that leaves Prince Harry in a shadow he may never escape. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal next isn't just gossip. It's a forensic look at the exact words that sent the palace into a tailspin and why the final exclusion changes everything for George, Charlotte, and the survival of the House of Windsor. The silence is gone, and in its place is a truth so cold, it has left the entire royal family in tears. The shockwaves from King Charles's announcement didn't just rattle the windows of the palace. They vibrated through the very foundation of the Commonwealth. What the public is seeing as a sudden outburst is, in reality, the culmination of a secrecy strategy that has been brewing behind closed doors for over 18 months. Inside the palace, this isn't just a disagreement. It is a system reaching its breaking point. The final exclusion is not a mere symbolic gesture. It is a clinical, administrative removal of Prince Harry from the royal ecosystem, a move so calculated it has left senior aides in a state of pure chaos. Reliable sources within the inner circle suggest that the king didn't act alone. This was a joint, visibly shaken decision made in tandem with Prince William. For months, William had played the role of the silent protector, watching as the palace machine tried to control reality through vague statements and polished palace lines. But the time for PR spin and optics management is over. The king and his heir stood side by side, finally admitting that the palace mask has slipped and the truth can no longer be dragged out at the last possible moment. The details of this exclusion are devastating. We are talking about a Category Red level of intervention, a protocol so rare it hasn't been activated in decades. It involves the permanent sealing of royal archives, the stripping of remaining honorary titles, and a complete contingency plan that removes Harry's name from any future regency acts. This is truth dragged out in its coldest form. The king, reportedly in tears, had to sign a directive that effectively treats his youngest son as a constitutional ghost. Why now? Why this sudden shift from privacy and space to total exclusion? The answer lies in the cracks of the institution. The king realized that a monarchy more afraid of truth than of scandal is a monarchy destined to fail. By choosing honest vulnerability over palace secrecy, Charles has essentially rewritten the monarchy's script. He has chosen to look directly at the cracks in the castle walls rather than trying to hide them behind beautiful paintings. But as the king retreats to the solitude of the highlands to process this strategic defeat, the question remains, what was the final straw? What did Charles see in the latest intelligence briefings that terrified him more than bad headlines? The final exclusion is just the beginning of a test of survival for the entire House of Windsor. The true chaos within the palace did not start with a public announcement. It ignited during a high-level closed meeting that overturned the familiar royal order. Inside the room, the atmosphere was described as so heavy that no one dared to speak first. This was the moment the palace machine reached its breaking point. King Charles, visibly shaken, faced a direct confrontation that challenged the very value system of the British monarchy. This wasn't just about Harry. It was about the secrecy and control that had defined the crown for centuries. Behind these closed doors, the mask of perfection finally slipped. For years, the institution prioritized image stability over transparency. But as the king signed the final exclusion papers, the raw, visceral emotion could no longer be hidden. Sources suggest that the conflict wasn't just between the king and his son, but between those who wanted to protect the institution at all costs and those who believed truth was the only foundation for survival. The tension reached its peak when senior royals began to realize the cost of silence. Silence in a public institution is another thing, and this silence had grown into a void being protected. King Charles reportedly had to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth. This wasn't transparency. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment. The king's decision was described as a moral failure by some insiders, while others saw it as a necessary moment for the future of the system. As the details of the Category Red directive began to leak, the palace realized that absolute control was beginning to loosen. The king's directive to silence the truth was met with resistance, not compliance. This confrontation exposed a deeper fear, not of Harry's condition or his actions, but of the public reaction if the truth were revealed in an uncontrollable way. The palace layers of defense did not collapse because of an investigation, but because of a system that could no longer hide its own cracks. The king, now isolated by his own choices, had to face the reality that the monarchy can bleed. Every polished palace line was now being questioned. The final exclusion was not just a legal document. It was a confession that the old way of operating was dead. As the world watches, the crown is forced to admit it is mortal. The final exclusion was never just a paperwork exercise. It was the moment the palace machine reached its ultimate breaking point. As the king's directive circulated through the corridors of power, it became clear that this was no longer about managing the optics. It was a desperate attempt to control reality itself. The king and his heir, standing side by side, had to admit that the emotional center of the monarchy had been far more damaged, for far longer, than anyone in power wanted to say out loud. The palace layers of defense weren't just cracking. They were being systematically dismantled from within. Inside the inner circle, the cost of silence had become a void being protected at all costs. For years, the monarchy had fed polished palace lines without context to the public, believing that stability was more important than transparency. But the final exclusion revealed a deeper truth. Silence in a public institution is another thing entirely. It is a confession of failure. Every reassurance photo and polished statement was now seen as part of a strategy of secrecy that had backfired. The king's decision to break the machine was a turning point that moved the crisis from a private tragedy to an institutional reckoning. He realized that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and that silence has a cost that the crown could no longer afford to pay. This wasn't transparency in the traditional sense. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment by a sovereign who saw the cracks in the house and realized they couldn't be hidden by hanging more beautiful paintings. The atmosphere at the palace was described as pure chaos as the mask of perfection finally fell away. Senior aides struggled to maintain the narrative of everything is fine, But the raw, visceral emotion of the king and the fracture past the point of no return made it impossible. The palace machine could no longer manage perception, because the perception was the crisis. By choosing honest vulnerability, the king had rewritten the monarchy's script, but at a price that would leave the royal family in tears for generations to come. This was the night the palace dropped its guard and blinked in the face of an uncontrollable truth. The institution was forced to admit that it is mortal, and that even the crown can bleed. The final exclusion was not just a legal severing. It was a direct confrontation between the old world of palace protocol and a new, raw reality that the king could no longer deny. Inside the palace, the atmosphere became so heavy that the traditional hierarchy began to dissolve under the weight of unanswered questions. King Charles, facing what was described as a constitutional crisis within his own bloodline, found that absolute control was beginning to loosen. The palace machine had tried to control reality itself for too long, but as the king stood in the center of the chaos, he realized that silence was no longer a passive choice. It was a moral failure. Insiders reveal that the mask of perfection didn't just slip. It was ripped off during a meeting where the king faced an impossible position. Every reassurance photo and polished palace line was now being viewed as truth dragged out at the last possible moment. The king realized that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and the category red level of intervention was a confession that the system had reached its breaking point. This wasn't just managing the optics. It was a test case for whether an ancient institution could survive its own human vulnerability. The final exclusion document, reportedly signed with shaking hands, was the moment Charles chose Kate's path of honest vulnerability over the cold palace statements that had failed him. He saw that the cracks in the house couldn't be fixed by hanging more beautiful paintings. They had to be looked at directly. This decision rewrote the monarchy's script and forced the institution to admit that even the crown can bleed. The raw, visceral emotion of a father realizing his son was now a constitutional ghost, left the royal family in tears. The void being protected at all costs had finally collapsed, and what remained was a monarchy forced to admit it is mortal. As the palace layers of defense fell away, the world saw not a sovereign, but a man terrified by what he saw at the bedside of his own legacy. The king's directive of final exclusion didn't just create an administrative void. It ignited a quiet act of opposition from the most unexpected quarters. As the palace machine tried to maintain its absolute control, a new alliance began to form, one that didn't come from power figures, but from those who had been silent for Kuo-Lao. Princess Catherine, long seen as the emotional center and a symbol of transparency, found herself standing at the boundary between royal duty and responsibility to truth. She realized that information control had crossed an ethical boundary. Behind the closed doors, Catherine was no longer seeking permission from the palace machine. She was seeking moral agreement. The Category Red Directive, intended to silence her through a special mechanism, only served to ignite a backlash few had anticipated. It was a direct confrontation between a mother and an institution that has existed for hundreds of years. Catherine saw that the cost of silence was becoming a void being protected at all costs, and she chose honest vulnerability over polished palace lines. The palace layers of defense began to fall not because of an outside attack, but because the direct heir, Prince William, refused to enforce the directive. His choice to allow Catherine to speak the truth was a moral choice stated without disguise. This irreversible fracture within the royal household proved that stability prioritized over transparency was a failing strategy. The king, now isolated by his own choices, had to watch as the mask of perfection was ripped off by those he expected to command. As the palace dropped its guard, the world realized that the final exclusion was not just about a prince, but about a system reaching its breaking point. The truth was being dragged out at the last possible moment, and it was a truth that would rewrite the monarchy's script forever. The royal family in tears was the final image of an ancient institution, forced to admit its own human vulnerability. The palace layers of defense did not collapse because of a sudden change of heart. They fell because of what seemed like a minor administrative error, a document sent to the wrong address within a secure system. This wasn't just any file. It was the information control strategy for the final exclusion. Within those few pages, the palace mask slipped completely, revealing that the silence was not a passive choice but a deliberate plan to control reality itself. The phrases inside, such as neurodevelopmental disorder and long-term monitoring, were enough to shatter the narrative that everything was fine. This leak proved that the palace machine was more afraid of truth than of scandal. The urgency backfired as more than 50 staff members were reprimanded and reassigned in a single day, a move without precedent that only strengthened the belief that something had been hidden for far too long. Veterans of the royal drama recognized that this was no longer a baseless rumor. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment. The void being protected at all costs was now exposed to the cold light of public scrutiny. As legal threats were sent to newsrooms to protect sources and stop speculation, the king faced an impossible position. His Category Red directive was no longer airtight. The public began to ask, who had decided to conceal it and why? This wasn't transparency. It was a test of survival for an ancient institution that had lost its moral compass. The final exclusion was now being viewed as a moral failure, and the cracks in the house were visible to everyone. The king, reportedly close to panic, realized that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing. The palace dropped its guard, and for the first time in modern history, the institution was forced to admit it is mortal, and that even the crown can bleed. The silence had become a confession that they had prioritized image stability over the rights of a child. The crisis of the final exclusion entered its most unpredictable phase when a call came through that did not go through secretaries or advisors. It was a moment where the familiar royal order was completely overturned. Prince Harry, the man at the center of the exclusion, broke his own silence in a 37-minute conversation that marked something unprecedented since Megxit. Harry didn't speak about media or strategy. He spoke about the cost of remaining silent for too long. He told Catherine, "If you do not speak, they will continue to decide for you." This call was a signal that absolute control was beginning to loosen. Inside the palace, the news of this silent alliance spread quickly, creating a heavy atmosphere that left many shaken. King Charles, already isolated by his own choices, realized that the palace machine could no longer control reality itself. The Category Red directive, intended to silence Catherine through a special mechanism, had effectively backfired. It was truth being dragged out at the last possible moment, and it was a truth that rewrote the monarchy's script. William's subsequent decision to refuse to enforce the directive was the most consequential decision since the crisis began. He understood that silence was no longer protecting his family. It was harming them. His statement, "If this destroys the monarchy, then it deserves to be destroyed," was a moral choice stated without disguise. This irreversible fracture meant that the palace dropped its guard and the mask of perfection was gone forever. As the king retreated to Balmoral, isolated and largely unreachable, the palace had to admit it was mortal. The final exclusion had not managed the optics. It had exposed the cracks in the house. The monarchy was now forced to admit it can bleed, and the royal family in tears was no longer a secret. Catherine was no longer seeking permission. She was seeking moral agreement to end the void being protected at all costs. The crisis reached its absolute zenith when the king's Category Red directive, a level of intervention not activated for decades, was openly defied. This was no longer an internal family matter. It was a test of the entire value system of the British monarchy. The directive, which aimed to temporarily strip a senior member of the right to speak, was a desperate attempt to control reality itself. But the palace machine had underestimated the power of honest vulnerability. Catherine, standing at the boundary between royal duty and responsibility to truth, realized that Silence was no longer protecting her family. It was harming them. The mask of perfection didn't just slip. It was ripped off as the irreversible fractures within the royal household became public. When Prince William made the most consequential decision to refuse to enforce the king's order, he effectively broke the machine. He understood that if a king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth, that's a problem. This wasn't transparency. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment. The palace dropped its guard. And for the first time, the void being protected at all costs was visible to the world. As the king retreated to Balmoral, isolated and largely unreachable, the palace layers of defense fell away. The Category Red directive had backfired, only serving to ignite a backlash few had anticipated. The phrase, "Let Catherine speak," surged to global prominence, proving that the monarchy was more afraid of truth than of scandal. This was a monarchy forced to admit it is mortal, struggling with a test of survival in a world that watched in real time. Catherine was no longer a solitary mother standing before a vast machine. She had become a symbol of humanity clashing with the institution. She understood that once she stepped into the light, every word would be remembered. The final exclusion had failed to manage perception, because the perception was the crisis. The world was no longer asking why Louis was absent. They were asking who had decided to conceal it and why. The final exclusion of Prince Harry was never just a family feud. It was the moment the British monarchy was forced to admit it can bleed. As the dust settles on this unprecedented crisis, the world is no longer looking at a harmless fairy tale, but at a system that nearly reached its breaking point. The palace machine, which for centuries prioritized image stability over humanity, has been forced to reset its entire script. This wasn't a routine update. It was a turning point where truth was dragged out at the last possible moment, leaving the royal family in tears and a nation in shock. King Charles, isolated in the Highlands, must now face a reality where absolute control is a relic of the past. The Category Red directive did not preserve the crown. It exposed the cracks in the house that can no longer be hidden by hanging beautiful paintings. The monarchy has been forced to admit it is mortal, and the price of that admission was the final exclusion of a son and the breaking of the palace machine. Catherine's decision to choose honest vulnerability over polished palace lines has created a new precedent. Health and humanity are not optional background noise. As the world watched this test of survival in real time, the question shifted from, why was there silence, to, can an ancient institution adapt to human vulnerability? The void being protected at all costs has been filled with a truth so cold, it has changed the crown forever. The palace mask has slipped, and what remains is an institution that must look directly at its own fractures to survive. But what about you? Do you believe the palace was right to prioritize image and stability through silence? Or was the final exclusion a moral failure that should have been avoided? Tell us in the comments. Do you stand with the machine or the mother? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the monarchy can't go back to pretending nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The truth has found its way out, and the story of the final exclusion is only the beginning of a new, unwritten chapter for the House of Windsor.